Novel excerpt, Rogue Marauder, Chapter 1. Corbett Macca scanned the bays of his spaceport with a keen and stern eye as he strode toward the damaged bay door. The arsenal of tools on his wide leather utility belt clicked together, warning the unwary of his approach. The scathing temperature of Sinnet spawned waves of heat that undulated above the tarmac, stirred only by Corbett's passage. The normally hot temperature had risen to barely tolerable in the summer season. Only the natives of the small, red, barren planet were anywhere near comfortable. Corbett dragged the sleeve of his work shirt across his dampened forehead, ducked through the 8-foot bay door, and coaxed the controls of the cooling system down to a more comfortable level in which to work. He inspected the damaged door, mumbling irately to himself about the scorch marks and dents caused by the blazer battle the previous night. Near the outer boundaries of Galaxy End, Sinnet appeared on approach to be just another peaceful, sparsely populated planet. It was, in fact, the most notorious safe haven for rogue star pilots, smugglers, and other unsavory characters, seeking refuge to recuperate from run-ins with the Intergalactic Corporation, the questionable galactic government, and their ruthless corporate police who patrolled the galaxy in pretense of keeping law and order. Sinnet was hands-off to the corporation by some obscure private agreement with the self-appointed local government run by Bakar Starka, a native of the planet and enterprising being of means best not studied too closely. Corbett spied two of Bakar's henchmen hanging around the opposite bay. He yanked on a dent in the bay door, the metal popping loudly and causing the unwelcomed creatures to jump and turn to find the portmaster's black eyes glaring in their direction. They scurried away. A small smile of satisfaction tugged at Corbett's lips as he returned to his work. Bakar had been warned to keep his men away from Corbia Spaceport, the only part of the isolated city Bakar didn't own. The unpleasant syndicate boss bore an uncanny resemblance to a rodent in human form and had a personality to match. He kept his variety of humanoid and alien henchmen scattered about to keep some semblance of order, an eye on the docking bays, and hopefully out of eyesight and arm's reach of the 10-foot Tendrite portmaster. Corbett, in his younger days, had been one of the wildest star pilots in the galaxy, a member of the nomadic Tendrite tribes who wandered the stars as traders and star merchants. He knew little about the Tendrites, as his father and mother determined their family not be without firm roots and a solid foundation. The concept was an oddity among their people, but there were no protests against the independence. The elder Macca, a master mechanic and technician, built Corbia Spaceport into a prosperous business, fighting anyone who attempted to interfere or take over his business. He gathered the best mechanics, technicians, engineers, and pilots in the galaxy to work in the port, luring many out of Bakar's clutches, which caused friction that escalated more than once into violent confrontations. Bakar eventually learned that Elia Macca and Tendrites in general were forces not to be reckoned with. Corbett had grown into the height and strength of his people, his skin sun-baked to a mahogany hue, his helmet of thick black hair worn to his broad shoulders, and broad, mustached face stern in countenance, especially when confronting Bakar's men. He gave the door another powerful yank, forcing his stubborn dent straight. There were days, especially during the summer season, he missed being a star pilot. His successful running days had come to an abrupt halt after his father was killed in a suspicious accident, leaving the port as Elia's only legacy to his son. That, and the fact that Corbett's Radurian partner had been injured in a near-fatal confrontation with corporate police, planted him firmly in the role of portmaster. He maneuvered the weight of the bay door into the frame, then used the plasma torch to repair the ragged gashes rent through the thick metal by blazer fire. He worked in silence, sweating in spite of the cooling system working overtime. He would have a stern discussion with the technician he'd assigned the repairs to the night before. He wondered vaguely where the man had disappeared to and if he'd returned. That thought gave him pause. If the technician was still absent, a visit to Bakar would be the next step, and that thought did please Corbett. Corbot's men were generally trustworthy, loyal to him and to their jobs. They were the best at what they did, were paid well, and treated with the respect they deserved by their employer. None of them dared cross him. When he bellowed an order, there was no hesitation in carrying it out. They respected him because they knew, despite his fierce appearance and looming height, Corbot was a quiet-spoken, reserved, and normally good-natured individual. His main dislike was people, human or otherwise, such as Bakar, and those who worked for the Phoenician. A grinding, squealing, clanking racket assaulted Corbot's ears. He straightened and frowned into the glare of the summer sky to watch a battered, scorched Denovan freighter settle into Bay Slot 4 directly across from where he worked. By the look of the outer hull, the old freighter had just managed to escape a run-in with the police cruisers patrolling the space outside of Sinnott's jurisdiction. Corbot needed a point to memorize the ships that came to his port and get to know as much about the assorted pilots as was available. He'd seen this old freighter a few times and knew little enough about its occupant. He stopped working and watched with interest as the protesting main hatch lowered and thumped to the ground. The fact that the freighter and its pilot were Denovan was enough to raise Corbot's interest, as Denovans had an aversion to their offspring taking to the stars. As far as Corbot was aware, this pilot was the only one in existence to break with that tradition. He suppressed his amusement as the human pilot climbed out of his ship, looking in worse shape than it did. If Corbot's information was correct, the man's name was Sneyd Archon, age about 24 human years, young for a Denovan, barely an adult by Tendrite reckoning. Archon kicked the landing gear in obvious disgust and walked somewhat unsteadily through the port, glancing briefly towards Corbot as he passed, probably heading to the nearest canteen. An unsettling feeling swept over Corbot. He watched until Archon was out of sight. The skirmish with a police cruiser was unnerving. However, when a pilot reached the safety of Sinnott with a police cruiser in pursuit, the result was normally jubilant bragging, whistling, and shouting. Archon had looked exhausted, his eyes hooded, his face haggard and pale, his gait sluggish as he made his way through the bay. Corbot hadn't seen any evidence of injury, but that was a possibility. If Archon was injured, Corbot hoped he had sense enough to go to a medical center to be cleared for flight before leaving. He'd have to keep an eye out for Archon. If the younger man seemed little better when he returned to his freighter, Corbot would ground him until he was cleared by a physician. Stretching his shoulders and neck, he returned to his work. It was usually best not to get too interested in the pilots who landed in the port, but he wasn't about to let one of them crash into his docking bays. He gathered his tools and was exiting the bay when he heard the growl of the turbo-ion engine of an old Raudurian space hauler as it landed expertly into slot 5. He took a deep breath, shaking his head in amusement. He knew all too well the history and identity of the old hauler and its pilot. The main hatch slid upward with a slight hiss, and a medium-sized girl, wearing the tight black breeches, off-white utility work tunic, and knee-high black boots of a Raudurian pilot, jumped lively to the ground, adjusting the low-slung holster on her slender hips. Honolin was known to every star pilot and portmaster in this part of the galaxy. Working for her father, she made frequent parts and supply runs to most of the planets in the corporation jurisdiction, and a few to places he was sure her father knew nothing about. He knew she was 18, and had heard she was hot-tempered, stubborn, and reputed to be better than most at handling a ship. As the saying went, the moon didn't travel out of its home planet's orbit. This reputation, Corbot suspected, was earned more by her coming to Sinnott and hanging around the canteen crowded with rogues and villains from the multitude of planets, moons, and asteroids scattered about the universe. He kept a close but discreet eye on her when she was in port, a favor to her father, his oldest and dearest friend, the Raudurian shipmate injured in the battle with the corporation so many years before. He suspected Deacon didn't know of his daughter's visits to Sinnott. Deacon was well acquainted with the type of riffraff who frequented the planet. He'd once been one of them. After being injured, his wife died, leaving him with a 5-year-old daughter. He had determined to raise her properly, and Corbot knew he would never approve of Honolin coming to the worst planet, nor of some associations she'd make there. Honolyn flicked her long brown hair away from her face with a characteristic toss of her head. She caught sight of Corbett watching her and offered a quick grin and short wave before disappearing through the bay. He returned her greeting with a slight nod of his head. Once she was out of sight, he crossed the port to the main building to log in the new arrivals.